and hello everybody. It's great that you've been able to join this call. I know that it's a very busy couple of weeks in terms of the activities in New York, and I did some work recently for Women's Spaces, just looking back over women's activism in Northern Ireland, particularly related to peace building, both locally and internationally. And one of the things that I always sort of say is that, peace building operates both during violent conflict and in the post-conflict situation. Sometimes international agencies tend to put the emphasis on the post-conflict situation, but actually there was a lot of peace building going on during the conflict in Northern Ireland, particularly at the local community-based women's groups level, where people did actually meet across our divided communities on largely on issues of common concern, mainly around poverty, around access to health, things like that. And one of the things that we were always very conscious of, and it's true, I think, of conflict societies generally, is when you have violent conflict, it takes the oxygen out of all other type of issues. So, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when we were setting up the first domestic violence refuges in Northern Ireland, when we were told that it wasn't an issue because it hadn't been spoken about. But actually, when we set up the first refuge in one of the cities in Northern Ireland, in Derry, we had 90 women and 300 children through that house in the first year. So issues become hidden because of the predominance of in our case the violent conflict around the constitutional issue. So while we all know that women are not a homogeneous group, and they have very many different aspirations, political aspirations, or whatever, what we did find was that it was possible to get conversation between women around issues that they shared in common, um, outside the constitutional issues. And we used to talk about women being active in terms of small p politics, in other words, those grassroots issues, as distinct from the big P politics, which was the electoral politics. And for many years, it was in that small P politics that women were brought together. But looking back, and it's now 30 years since the Beijing conference in 1995, that really was one of the high points, I think, in terms of relating the sort of the local work in Northern Ireland to the international dimension. And a delegation drawn up of women from trade unions, from community groups, and from issue-based groups actually went to Beijing and brought back a lot of the learning and the awareness of the discussion around the international frameworks. And that became really important for us, albeit that we didn't have UN 1325 until the year 2000. And the other thing was that we did have the one organisation, what was then the Northern Ireland Women's European Platform, now Joanna's Women's Spaces, actually keeping a focus on international issues from the sort of the mid 1980s on, and particularly a focus on what was happening in Europe, because Northern Ireland, indeed Ireland at the time, was a very much a sort of conservative patriarchal society. And we used the information of what was happening in other countries in Europe to argue for legislative change, for updating the sort of regulations and all the rest in Northern Ireland. And we used the equality framing from the European Commission, the European Union, to actually do that at the time. What we then had, which probably was unique to Northern Ireland to an extent, was we had a peace process in the mid 1990s. And a lot of the women's groups actually had been lobbying for greater representation of women in the main political parties here. And a response we were getting was, oh, well, we'd love to put women forward, but they won't stand, we can't get them to put their names forward as candidates. So, in effect, what we did was we set up the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition as a shot across the bows of the mainstream parties. We didn't actually think, to be honest, we were going to get elected. We set it up 6 weeks before the elections to the peace talks. But we actually did get elected. But more importantly, we got 76 women to agree to stand as candidates in a 6-week period, which was basically saying to the political parties, well, sorry, if you can't get women to stand, you're looking in the wrong places, because actually they are prepared to stand. And what we asked them to do was to stand on shared values, 3 shared values of human rights, equality, and inclusion, that we spoke to everyone. And we had a co-leadership of a woman drawn from the Protestant Unionist Loyalist tradition and a woman drawn from the Catholic Nationalist Republican position. Because again, we were very conscious of the importance of, women from whatever background being able to see themselves reflected in the coalition. And I always remember the headline in the local newspaper whenever the night of the election results was "Hen Party comes home to roost." So I mean, it was treated as a joke to an extent. However, you know, as part of the coalition, we were able to get some things into the peace agreement. Not as much as people have done since, Colombia and different places, but we did get, a line about increasing the representation of women in decision making, and we got issues like the setting up of a civic forum to encourage participative democracy, which was done for about 2 years, and then the mainstream parties got rid of it. And then supported issues around human rights and equality. Now, what we also learned very quickly was when you get involved in that level of decision making and peace building, you also are forced to make compromises. I mean, there was a lot of issues that were dear to the heart of the women's movement that actually we couldn't get into the peace agreement. And indeed, when we raised them, we were laughed at. However, by 1998, we had got our Good Friday Agreement, our Belfast Agreement. One of the other learning points that we had very quickly was you can get something into an agreement, but actually what you need to keep an eye on is implementation. Because just because it's in a peace agreement doesn't mean to say necessarily that it will be implemented in practice. Whenever we came to 2000 and we had the Women, Peace and Security resolutions, again, for us, it was really important because it gave a framing to a lot of the arguments that we were, putting forward. And it gave an international framing to it, which I think, we were able then to use that to argue for different policies. However, our peace agreement, while it has been, relatively successful in terms of minimizing violence, it has been a bit of a roller coaster. We've had long periods when our devolved government wasn't working. So again, the women's issues tended to drop down the agenda, and a lot of attention was given to the sort of very male-dominated areas of decommissioning weaponry, of demobilizing paramilitaries, and there were very few women's voices in that discussion, despite the fact that there had been actually women combatants. But even they would say that, their voices were fairly muted. And actually, again, Women's Spaces held a hearing in 2004 entitled 1325 on Trial, where, women's groups came along and sort of said, well, look, this is what we're finding. These things are not being addressed. So the unanimous verdict was that 1325 actually had not been effectively applied to Northern Ireland. Now, what we had going for us, to be honest, over those years, which again, some post-conflict situations have not, is we did have a great reliance on resourcing support from the European Commission peace programme. And equality was one of the issues that was always a horizontal principle in that, albeit that was very much project funding for 2 years here, 3 years there, and actually was quite complex in terms of accounting for. But we did have, some sort of an ability there, if you like, to sort of continue some of the grassroots women's activism. Now, what we found was that the further we moved away from our peace agreement, the more difficult it was to get resourcing for a lot of the grassroots women's work. It was almost as though the politicians or the policymakers felt that that box was ticked. Women had done their bit for peace building. Let's move on to something else. And even still, some of the controversial issues we have still with the remnants of paramilitarism and the rest, and indeed the symbolic issues around what flags you fly or whatever, women are not as they don't tend to be appointed to those sort of commissions. It tends to go back to the mainstream parties or indeed men. And there was a report that was carried out in 2008, looking at well, why women weren't actually sort of being represented to the extent that they should be, and they came up with a number of issues that will be, I'm sure, shared by a lot of you. Domestic responsibilities, the double workload, ongoing cultural attitudes to the position of women in society. Related to that, sometimes the lack of family support, lack of finance, lack of confidence, and lack of traditional political party support. So it sort of came down to what we talk about as the four C's: cash, childcare, confidence, and the ability to become candidates. Now, having said that, in fairness, over the last 20 years or so, we have seen an increase in the number of elected women in our governing assembly, and indeed our first minister and deputy first minister at the moment are both women. However, there still is a gap to be made up, and the fact that one of the things that we haven't really been able to get effectively is cross-party working of women on women's issues, which happens in a number of other jurisdictions. There is, in fairness, a cross-party assembly group on 1325, but it tends to be quite sort of low profile in terms of getting its views across. The other thing that we have seen, I suppose, is over the last number of years, is that we have an increased number of individual women who would have become known internationally through their work, mainly through the coalition, but also through some peace building organizations like Mediation Northern Ireland and the like. And they would be very well networked in terms of giving expert advice in a range of different conflict situations around the globe. And the Irish government, when it developed its Irish National Action Plan around 1325, did draw on and continues to draw on to an extent women with the learning from Northern Ireland, particularly when they were working on sort of issues in Liberia and Timor-Leste, and still would use women from Northern Ireland in terms of their embassies in places like Cyprus, Tel Aviv, and different places. The other things more recently we found, which I think is to be welcomed, is an increased emphasis on women and peace building, the learning from Northern Ireland, that's probably reflected in a number of women academics around the whole issue of the gender-based violence, about what is the sort of representation of women in terms of mediation, and indeed there was a grouping that did work around legacy gender issues. Again, in Northern Ireland, we haven't been able to yet deal effectively with the legacy of the conflict. I'm conscious of time, so I'll end by sort of saying one of the things that we are now welcoming actually is that only last year, for the first time, the United Kingdom's National Action Plan on 1325 did more specifically talk about learning from Northern Ireland. Up to that point, they didn't really, because if you like, the macro narrative from the British state was always that the Northern Ireland conflict was not political. It was an aggravated crime wave, which we have basically sort of ignored. But anyway, for just there, as I say, last year, there seemed to be movement on that. So one of the optimistic things is possibly a north-south and east-west framing in terms of how we put across 1325, in terms of capturing the learning from Northern Ireland, but also sharing it with others. And I suppose the last thing I'd say is, that in doing that, it is really important. And there was a project that the Community Foundation for Northern Ireland was involved in with Women's Resource Development Agency and others back in 2014, where they took the four pillars of 1325 and actually used it to have meetings and discussions with almost 1,000 women, local women in Northern Ireland. And one of the things we found was really important was turning the language that is used at the UN and other agencies into everyday language that women can understand and get their arms around. Because there is always a danger that, when we're campaigning, and it's very important that campaigning and advocacy at that international level, that we don't leave women in local communities behind. So perhaps if I finish there, thank you.
Thank you so much, Avila. Thank you so much, Avila. That's a very brief history of women's involvement in peace building in Northern Ireland. I think what needs to be said is that we're still very much building on the Women's Coalition and what was achieved in that time, and some of those issues remain very much the same, and in particular the issue of making women's voices heard, for example. So, for example, Northern Ireland was developing a gender equality strategy that has just unilaterally by a minister been shelved indefinitely. So, as I said, we will have time for a discussion at the end, but just are there any immediate questions for Avila or any clarifications? I'm trying to check, but just unmute yourself or, indicate if you'd like the floor. No, all very clear so far. So thank you so much, Avila, and we look forward to bringing you back into the discussion. Now I'm delighted to invite Daniela Suarez, who is based in Belfast, but is from Colombia and has researched women and the issues in Colombia. Daniela, you are very welcome, and you can introduce yourself. You have the floor.
Okay, hello everyone. So I'm very happy to be here, and to share the Colombian experience, to give you kind of like a brief introduction of myself. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the School of Law in Queen's University, Belfast, and I have been researching mainly the issue of sexual and gender-based violence inside guerrilla and paramilitary groups in Colombia, and kind of like this construction of the concept of the victim or victimhood status in Colombia, and how it has kind of like reframed the recognition of female fighters that experience this specific type of violence as victims of the conflict. But also part of my research is kind of like understanding a bit the engagement of women and LGBTQ movements and how they have pushed for a more inclusive agenda in relation to gender and recognizing female fighters as victims too within the transitional justice process. So today I'm going to try to share, I think, let me see if I can share my slides. I don't know, Jonah, I think this is the good option. Yes, let's see. So I think you can see now, right? Here.
Not just yet, Daniela.
No. Second. Yeah. Can you see something now?
No. No. I've made you co-host there, Daniela, just in case that sorts the problem?
Let's see this one.
Yes, now we can see.
Okay, perfect. Okay, just to give you kind of like a I will try to give you like a very general context of the whole experience of women and peace building in Colombia, particularly in the last 10 years. For you people, if you're not very familiar with the Colombian context, so we have been experiencing an armed conflict at least since the 1960s. It's a quite complex internal armed conflict that has like different kind of like changing dynamics throughout like the different decades, and has involved like different armed actors, particularly in the case of women. Women have been one of the most impacted by the armed conflict. The victims unit has reported that at least 50.2% of the victims of the conflict are women, especially women that come from rural backgrounds and indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities. Still, I have to pinpoint that this number of the victims unit actually doesn't show up the whole number of victims of the conflict, because first, it only reflects the victims of the conflict between 1985 to nowadays. So basically, we don't have like the exact numbers, or like we are not including the victims between 1960s and 1985. And also there are very like strict requirements for being recognized as a victim in the case of the victims unit. So probably this number might be even higher, because we're leaving behind some victims, especially women victims, that probably cannot be recognized by the victims unit. Apart from that, like we also have to recognize that women not only have had like the role of victims in the conflict, they also have had the role of armed actors, or like combatants, at least particularly in guerrilla groups. They usually were very involved in the armed groups, particularly in the case of the FARC, that is one of the biggest guerrilla groups in Colombia, was around 30 to 40% of combatants were women. And now kind of like in the issue of peace building, particularly in the issue of women organizations, I have to pinpoint that women's organizations have been very, very active in the Colombian armed conflict or in the peace building process. Although in early peace processes, particularly those peace processes that were in the 1990s and 2000s, the participation of women, especially within the peace negotiations, were either very limited or restricted, minimal, or even sometimes like non-existent at all. Still, women's movement have been very active since the 1990s, and throughout like the last 30, 40 years, they have been very, very active in doing social, political, and legal activism to kind of like mainstream the WPS agenda and the gender perspective within the peace building policies in Colombia. One of like the main, for example, coalitions, particularly in relation to the WPS agenda, is Alianza 1325. So this is a coalition of at least 14 feminist and women organizations that have pushed for the mainstreaming of the WPS agenda and the creation of the first national action plan in Colombia. Also, they have used, or they have relied a lot on the Constitutional Court, so bringing cases to the Constitutional Court as a way to create constitutional framings for the protection of women, particularly, for example, in cases of displaced women, and also in the inclusion of like some of the foundations of the WPS agenda in matters of like the reincorporation of female fighters, and kind of like ensuring mechanisms for their security and also mechanisms for their political participation. I think like probably the most relevant, or like the most relevant example right now of participation of women organizations in the peace process, in peace building in Colombia, was the 2016 peace agreement or peace process. That was the most recent and probably one of the biggest kind of like peace building processes so far in Colombia. It was between the Colombian government and the guerrilla group FARC. It happened between 2012 and 2016. And although initially women weren't included, or women organizations weren't included in the peace negotiations, they pushed and they continue lobbying both the FARC and the government to be included within the peace talks in Havana. And eventually they managed to get that. They succeeded in doing so. Both the government and the FARC decided to create a gender commission that work jointly with women's organization as a way to mainstream gender within the whole peace negotiation and also the peace process. And I think I have also to highlight the importance that many of the women and feminist organizations that work in this stage of peace building, they basically embrace the language of the WPS agenda as a way to justify or have kind of like a legal kind of like justification or foundation for them to being included in the whole peace building and peace process. They had a strong influence, although I have to note that because of like the actual the kind of like the approval of the peace process later on, some parts of the gender approach of the peace process was a bit limited, but still the influence of women in the whole peace process was very relevant. They managed to include different aspects that kind of like make a beneficial or benefit women, particularly in issues related to rural reform, to political participation, to justice, and also it was very relevant to highlight their engagement both with the gender subcommission, but also with grassroots organizations as a way to disseminate the whole peace process. They also have participated now in the whole, we are now in the implementation stage of the peace process. They have been very, very active with the Truth Commission and with the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. That's basically the tribunal that was created with the peace agreement. And women organizations have been key by submitting reports and participated in different like extrajudicial events and also hearings in kind of like pushing or forcing these institutions to adopt a gender approach at the moment of addressing gender-based violence. And not only a gender approach, but also kind of like an intersectional approach in relation to gender-based violence, kind of like recognizing that this type of violence is not universal, you cannot homogenize gender-based violence. So like depending on your ethnicity, on your race, on your geographical area, and your political affiliation, on your gender identity or sexual orientation, your experience of gender-based violence will be completely different. So that has been one of the kind of like success or like that women's organizations have had in these two institutions. And also in the case of the HEP, that is this special tribunal, we managed to open the first macro case that is going to focus entirely on prosecuting and investigating gender-based violence, even though the tribunal initially was very reluctant in doing so, but eventually they concede or like they agree to do it because they consider it was more beneficial for the victims and considering the whole pressure put on by women and LGBTQ organizations. Still, this case is kind of like in the early stages, so we cannot assure what is going to be the result, but so far the tribunal has shown a disposition to adopt an intersectional gender approach in relation to gender-based violence. Also, I think it's very relevant to mention kind of like the engagement of this organization in the creation of the first national action plan that is very, very recent. Particularly, this was also due in part of like kind of like the disposition of the current government, the Gustavo Petro's government, in placing women as part of the core of his like government agenda and strategy. So like the national development plan, it has one of the issues is the issue of women and peace building, and one of his commitments as a president was the creation of the first national action plan. But this first national action plan was not only created kind of like from a top-down point of view, but actually more kind of like in a collaborative way from women's organizations, both big women's organizations, but also grassroots organizations, and as way with collaboration of international cooperation and local authorities in Colombia. So the first national action plan in the end managed to involve at least 27 women and feminist organizations. It was issued in November 2024, so it's a very, very recent national action plan. It's supposed to last 10 years. Kind of like the guiding principles, you will see like the language when you read the national action plan is like kind of like the same language that you will find in the WPS agenda. But I think it's very interesting that they make a lot of emphasis on kind of like recognizing the diverse experiences of women, recognizing kind of like is particularly in relation to the race, to the gender, to the sexual orientation, to the geographical area too, and also what they call the life cycle. So it's related also kind of like to the age, like the experiences of women, of girls, adult women, and elderly women are completely different. So I think this is kind of like key in like the framing or the language that you will see in the National Action Plan. Of course, one of the main ideas is trying to promote this idea of women as peacekeepers, as mediators, as the kind of like the first guarantors in the solution or the transformation of the conflict. They also are trying to address issues related to the provision of an integral health of women, particularly reproductive health and also mental health, but not only health from the point of view of kind of like Western medicine, but kind of like respecting and acknowledging to like other kind of like indigenous or ancestral or community practices at the moment of like guaranteeing the health of these women. And also they have an interest in issues that they also decided to include human mobility, so within the National Action Plan, and not only in reference to women that were forcibly displaced, internally forcibly displaced by the conflict, but also refugees and women that have been forced to, like Colombian women that have been forced to flee the country to other countries, but also particularly the issue of, for example, Venezuelans moving from from Venezuela to Colombia. And also because usually these women also face, like, there is an issue of like this kind of like refugee status, that many of these women also are experiencing violence within the border areas of Colombia and Venezuela, Colombia and Ecuador, Colombia and Panama, which now human trafficking and like immigrant smuggling has become part of like the conflict in some way, or part of the dynamics of the conflict. I think another interesting thing is, again, kind of like in the process of the implementation and probably the monitoring of the National Action Plan, what the government has said is that, again, it's not a top-down kind of like mechanism, but again, it's going to be a collaborative mechanism in which women's organizations have also a role in the process of implementing and monitoring the National Action Plan, particularly in helping the government to bridge kind of like, or to build bridges between the national entity or like the national government with grassroots and more local like organizations and women particularly. And yeah, like again, like a special guarantee. So it's very, very relevant. Like I found fascinating the issue that they recognize the role of indigenous and Afro-descendant women, recognizing them as political leaders or like political actors, but not only kind of like from a westernized, again, kind of like feminist view of political actors, but kind of like saying that it's important to also respect their participation according to their own traditions, their own practices, and their own communities. So this is, I think this is kind of like very, very interesting for like the framing of the National Action Plan. But yeah, and some kind of like final remarks about this. So like, yeah, definitely like women's organizations have been essential in the whole like mainstreaming of gender peace building in Colombia, and the mainstreaming of the WPS agenda within Colombia. Still, like it's not kind of like a settled or it's not like a perfect process. Of course, there's still a lot of challenges. And one thing, as Avila said, one thing is like being successful in gaining kind of like legal frameworks, and other thing is actually implementing those policies or those legal framework in practices, particularly the National Action Plan. So it still is very recent, so we cannot like assess yet how successful is going to be like this very progressive National Action Plan. I think it's also essential that for these type of like outcomes to happen, is not only essential the activism of women organizations, but it's also essential to have institutions that are keen or to work together with these women's organization, either like big women's organization and also grassroots organizations, but not only like simply engaging or like bringing them to events, but actually including them in the whole drafting, implementation, and monitoring process of these policies. So that has been, for example, the case of the Truth Commission, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, and of course, like in this specifically drafting of the NAP of the National Action Plan. And it's very important, again, to pinpoint like the communication also, or engaging with indigenous and Afro-descendant communities and Afro-descendant women, which I think have been able to nuance a bit also like this gender mainstreaming without being like a completely white or like urban kind of like feminism that kind of like is hegemonic within usually these type of agendas. And I think current challenges or like some of the potential challenges that like this kind of like mobilization might face. Of course, the political environment in Colombia is very polarizing. So to have like these institutions being like or like able or like keen to work with women's organizations depends on every like kind of like a governmental term, basically. So right now we have has been relatively keen to work with women's organizations, but we don't know like once this government leaves, if the next government is also going to be as keen or will also have women as a priority within his government agenda. And of course, like the international context right now. So like the whole changing of the political climate in international matters, particularly in relation to the United States, like he's kind of like the point of view of a more cautious or like restrictive, I don't know how to say it, but not very good point of view in relation to gender or like a priority in gender and peace creates a lot of uncertainty of how all these initiatives, all these efforts, all this policy are going to materialize, and also kind of like raises the question for us as countries from the global south in the dependency of our policies also in these international entities, especially when they're also very, despite like they're pretending to seem very democratic and everything, and that's what they usually, the discourse is that they have, they're also very volatile within their politics, but their volatility on their politics not only impacts those countries but also impacts our countries locally. So yeah, so that's kind of like one of the challenges that I think probably like this mobilization and all these efforts might face in Colombia right now. But yeah, so this will be kind of like my presentation for today, but I'm happy to hear any other thoughts or like continue discussing this with you.
Thank you so much for that, Daniela. That's a very inspiring overview of the significant change in Colombia, and it's been so interesting to watch, to see how women have given themselves a very clear role in that. And I think it's a very clear reminder as well of how important it is to be intersectional and ensure that different women from all backgrounds can participate effectively in that. And overall, it's very difficult to look at any of this without looking at the current global context and how challenging it is. And while we had planned this event before the latest changes, I think that is something that's, from our perspective, building solidarity in any way we can is more important than ever. I know I certainly have a lot of questions for Daniela, which I will hold on to for now, but anything immediate, any clarification or questions? No? Okay, so we had hoped to have a speaker from Iraq, but unfortunately at very last minute, she can't be here. So I am delighted to then move on to our next speaker, Detmar Kremer from GAPS, or Gender Action in Peace and Security. And Detmar, go ahead, you have the floor.
Great, thank you so much, Jana. Just pulling up here. Yes, thank you so much. And yeah, so my name is Detmar. I'm the Policy Advocacy and Communications Coordinator at GAPS. And thank you so much, Jana and NIWeb, for organizing this conversation. We're also thrilled to have been able to co-sponsor it, and always, working with you, Jana, is a joy and a delight. I also want to thank the incredible women I share this panel with. I'm very privileged to be speaking after you, and I've already learned so much from both of your interventions. I'm really grateful for both of you and the experience you share. For those who are not familiar with GAPS, or Gender Action for Peace and Security, we are the UK civil society network on women, peace and security. We're a membership network, and our members are human rights, women's rights, humanitarian development, and peace building organizations. And our core mandate is to assess the UK's implementation of women, peace and security. We do this across all devolved nations as well as internationally. And NIWeb is one of our members. And as Phil had already mentioned, this in the current iteration of the National Action Plan for the UK is the first time Northern Ireland is really explicitly included as an area that kind of considered in the implementation of women, peace and security. And this is a very exciting move forward in how the UK understands women, peace and security, although similar to what Avila already mentioned, there's still kind of a lack of clarity on exactly what this means, how this is implemented. We are kind of concerned that it still takes a very narrow focus, generally on kind of like narrow, vague focus, and still kind of refuses to consider Northern Ireland a post-conflict situation and the kind of lessons and practices that come from that, as well as the UK still doesn't consider women, peace and security an agenda that applies to the other devolved nations as well. So what we do as GAPS, we work with the United Kingdom, of course, but also many other governments that have included actually Colombia as well, but also the Philippines, Kosovo, Libya, Jordan, the Netherlands. It's a wide range of governments that we've worked with. as well as across multilateral organizations to consider how women, peace, and security is created, how it is implemented, how it is considered. This is also kind of where some of the experience and insight from my remarks are drawn from. So I was asked to talk a little bit about kind of like trends that we're seeing in women, peace, and security, and I thought to focus about kind of three different things. So one, as we've all kind of alluded to, of course, the context we are in, and I kind of wanted to spell out what are the kind of main parts of the context that we're seeing and that are impacting the WPS agenda, and then talk specifically a bit more about the anti-gender movement, and then our kind of like core priority, which is about resourcing. And then I will end my talk after that. So as many already alluded to, and as many know on this call, of course, that we're finding ourselves in quite a significantly dire context. And I do apologize that this little part of my presentation is a little depressing. So 2025 is quite a significant year in many parts of the global gender architecture. It's the 30th anniversary, of course, of the Beijing Platform for Action, as well as the 25th anniversary of the WPS agenda. The context demands that we really think about these anniversaries and what it means on how we're actually implementing them. This is particularly important as we're seeing different kinds of attacks emerge. I think it's very important to kind of spell out what these developments are. Of course, my colleagues have already alluded to many of them. And it's very important to underscore that these issues cannot be treated in silos and that a genuine commitment to an investment in gender equality is essential to tackle them. So I think really clear, right, is that gender equality is never just like a nice thing to have on the side. It's fundamental in tackling all of these issues. This, of course, has been kind of covered by different kinds of resolutions under the Women, Peace, and Security agenda that have been adopted since 2000 and since 1325. But also what I think is kind of important to highlight is that generally within the WPS movement right now, there's a lot of fear that if there were to be a new resolution right now, the political moment, first of all, likely means it wouldn't be passed, but also if something were to be passed, it could even be detrimental to the agenda. I also kind of wanted to talk particularly here about these challenges because we see that they are also named in different national action plans. So there's already an understanding that are connected to women, peace, and security. So very quickly, a big part, of course, is rising conflict that we're seeing around the world. It's longer lasting, it's more protracted, it's increasingly cross-border, and it's more often fought in densely populated urban areas. I will not try to give an exhaustive list, but of course, I think it is important to just name a few cases, such as Palestine, Yemen, Syria, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Myanmar, Sudan, Haiti, the DRC. I also think it's very important to note, of course, that we are currently, that February was the hottest February ever recorded, and that 2024 as a year was warmer than the 1.5 degrees agreed upon in the Paris Agreement. So we're seeing climate change as a conflict driver increasing as well. We're seeing that through resource scarcity as well as resource abundance, and that there's a higher likelihood of conflict in unexpected contexts as a result. We're also seeing increasingly the interconnections between the climate emergency and conflict, as well as ecocides, for example, in Palestine and Ukraine, have made very clear. More people are forced to move as a result, creating growing displaced communities whose needs are often not met and whose legal rights are increasingly eroded internationally. Consider, for example, the anti-refugee fear-mongering of global north governments that we're seeing at increasing and sharper rates. Lastly, there's also new unregulated technologies that are changing the way conflict happens, including, for example, the role AI has placed in the racialized targeting of Palestinians or the spread of misinformation with incendiary offline consequences that we see in the United Kingdom in the race riots over the summer, in India and increased persecution, particularly of Muslims, as well as in the genocide against the Rohingya in Myanmar. So moving to the anti-gender movement, I understand that the context I've outlined here is quite bleak, and it will just get a little bit more bleak as I talk about the anti-gender movement before I promise we get a bit better again. So what I think is very clear when we think about the anti-gender movement is that it's very important to understand that this is a very coordinated, well-funded, and resourced movement that's around the world, whose aim is to kind of erode advances in gender equality. Its intention, that is not a coincidence. It's often organized around maintaining certain power structures and ensuring certain elites stay in power. We also see that when we trace the funding, that is largely funded by Russian and American donors who are often evangelical with other religious aims as well. and that it's exported around the world. What we see, and it's a tale, of course, as old as time, it starts by targeting the more marginalized and made vulnerable aspects of the gender equality movement. For example, transgender women, access to abortion, and explicitly feminist organizing. Where these tactics work, it then duplicates them. For example, we have seen in Uganda, particular anti-LGBTQI+ legislation, and where that was successful, have seen the same strategies be replicated elsewhere. We've also seen this in the anti-abortion and forced birth organizing, particularly in the United States, that has then also been replicated elsewhere. These influences, of course, also come then on top of already existing patriarchal and colonial structures, and therefore very, very dangerous. A very, I think, powerful example where we see how particularly women-led and women's rights organizations in conflict situations are able to navigate this and provide alternatives is Iraq. And as Susan won't be able to join us, I thought I could kind of talk about that a little bit. So we still hear some of the lessons learned from Iraq that those organizations have shared with us at GAPS as well as NIWA. An increasing anti-gender movement has been very active in Iraq. We're seeing increasingly criminalization of using language like gender. We're seeing changes made in the penal code, criminalizing homosexuality, lowering the age of marriage, and other kind of very worrying developments. And the space to resist that has become smaller and smaller as there's a kind of very potent narrative in conflating feminism with the West, and therefore there's a kind of cooptation of anti-colonial language. By being anti-gender, you're being anti-colonial, and this is something a lot of movements on the ground are trying to particularly confront and navigate. And what has been really powerful has been the organizing of the women's rights movement in Iraq, where it is through that coalition building and movement building, they've also, similar, as we've heard from Avil and Daniela, been able to identify with the women, peace and security agenda as a possible pathway to do so. So Iraq has become the first country in the region, the Middle Eastern region, to adopt a national action plan. And through that has been really able to encode significant progress on political participation of women, creating civic space to be able to talk about gender, and through that movement as well has been able to kind of figure out, okay, how can we continue doing feminist organizing in a language that first of all allows us to be safe, but also is more culturally appropriate to the context. So what we often see in countries outside of English-speaking spaces, we see words like gender not being translated into a local language. So people will be speaking their language and then use the word gender equality or LGBTQI+. And these are, of course, are foreign words. And so what these movements also are able to do is to figure out what are the actual words in Arabic, and particularly the Iraqi kind of Arabic or the different Kurdish languages that are spoken in Iraq. What are the words that make sense here? How can we then use those words and really embed this agenda and how we organize? And so there we've seen a lot of progress and able to have pushback on a lot of these developments and carve out additional space to maintain these agendas. And so here again, I think it's very important that we think about how can we actually link up these transnational movements, because where I'm calling from here in the United Kingdom, we are really struggling confronting the anti-gender movement. If in Iraq there is this success, what can we learn from Iraq that we might need to apply here? So we're also kind of subverting some of these ways knowledge often travels, right? Making sure that we in the global north can actually learn generally from the global south, because right now we're not being great up here. A lot of interesting parts on that are actually coming out in a short briefing paper Jana and I wrote together on how transnational movements can be linked up. So that will be coming out in a little bit, and we'll be sure to share that as well. The last very quick point is, and I will make this quick because I think this is a point that has been made by everyone in our sector again and again and again, and it is just increasingly higher time for it to be heard, is around resourcing. I think this is especially important when we're looking at trends in the WPS space, but also the wider space. And even before we started this call, we were talking about it. Of course, the donor space is rapidly shifting. The United States has cut all of its funding, but other states, including the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland, France, are also retreating from their funding. And this means that the already very, very small amount of funding that women's rights organizations, let alone women's coalitions, received is even shrinking further. And this is a very, very dire, because as has become clear from the interventions of my colleagues, women's rights organizations, women-led organizations, feminist movements, or the experts of their own communities are often the main actors preventing and resolving conflict, are frontline defenders, first responders, and able to reach communities to deliver essential services that many INGOs often are not able to. And they often do so on a shoestring budget, if there is a budget at all. And often this work also isn't necessarily called peace building or women, peace and security. People often just do it because this is what they've always done for their communities. And so there's even another kind of gap between accessing some of this funding, because their work's often not understood as this kind of work. And all of these things are something women and LGBT plus people have always known. But I do think a positive trend is this growing recognition within the WPS space that indeed women-led women's rights and feminist movements fulfill this role. And there's a growing recognition of that. However, the actions remain missing. So as I said before, that funding remains small. In 2020, just 1% of gender-focused aid, for example, went to support networks. And that was 5 years ago, pre-COVID and pre-Trump. So what is left of that funding is unclear. I think the call we always make that is very important is that core, flexible, unrestricted, and predictable funding that would allow movements to thrive, that could build capacity, facilitate convening, compensate for the time it takes to participate and do the work, be able to build a voice and presence that also can go cut across borders and movements and collaborate and create a resilient, united bulwark against this anti-gender movement. I think my final thing I'll say in closing, I think increasingly we're seeing news every day that is becoming more and more urgent. I think just yesterday we heard that Hungary is banning Pride and LGBT organizations and introducing massive amounts of facial recognition software and surveillance into how it does so. This is not disconnected from other violence and conflict we see around the world. And we see this kind of spreading in this way. And unless we are able to resource the movements to resist this trend doesn't seem to be reserved. So again, it's kind of call to states, funds, philanthropists, donors, all of this to actually be able to resource the people who are doing this work. Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to hear your questions. And I hope I didn't end on too negative of a note.
Thank you so much, Detmer. I think that's a key point that is absolutely critical at this point to discuss, because I was very lucky to be in New York at CSW last week in person, and that was something that came up again and again, and how the cuts are affecting different parts of the women's sector disproportionately. So, and work on peace building is usually done on a shoestring, even though it has benefits for society as a whole. So the point very well made, and apologies, I entirely forgot. I should have, of course, from the very beginning introduced GAPS as the co-host and co-sponsor of this event. We are delighted to be working with GAPS on issues including exploring networking for women peace builders internationally, and on the shadow report to the UK NAP as well. I think what I might do is I might remove the spotlights so that we can see each other a bit better for the discussion. So delighted, we have quite a good amount of time for questions and for discussion. So you can just put your hand up or put your question in the chat or unmute yourself. So if you want to think for a moment, the one thing that I find particularly fascinating, Daniela, about Colombia is that there seems to be a process of, there seems to be a degree of trust between women and a government. And that seems to me a crucial difference from many other post-conflict contexts. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, and delighted for Detmer and Avila, you to come in your thoughts on the difficulties in developing that trust and rebuilding that trust, particularly where we find ourselves right now, but any
Yes, well, yes, there is kind of like a trust, but it's a bit relative. It's not like an absolute trust between like the government and the and women's organizations. I think particularly with the issue of like the whole like kind of like peace process and everything, I would say women and LGBTQ organizations become a bit like stronger, at least like in kind of like in a public space or like publicly, they become a bit more stronger. So I think that also kind of like counterbalance a bit of the dynamics between the government and these organizations. Also, initially, what it has been said is like the current government is very keen to work with them, but also like within the implement or like within the whole like government of the president later in the last few months actually has been a bit more complex. Also because sometimes there are some women that seem that although he has like this speech that seems to be supportive in relation to women, like kind of like rights or like feminist type of peace building, also within the dynamics of the government, sometimes there are like a bit of patriarchal dynamics. No one, for example, there is a bit of a scandal of about like him leaving some of the politicians in his cabinet that have been denounced previously as women abusers or like being involved in issues of domestic violence or domestic abuse. So they said kind of like these two kind of like face of like try to support a bit like the feminist agenda or like the feminist peace building agenda, but also like not addressing kind of like some patriarchal dynamics that are embedded within the ordinary politics of of Colombia in general. But particularly in the issue of the conflict, also I think like a key aspect I would say is also the role of like the vice president. Probably she will have like a better, I would say, more trust in relation to the work of women's organization because she comes from a grassroots type of leadership. So before she was a vice president, she came from a Afro-descendant community and she was like a grassroots leader, environmental like leader and human rights defender. So she had kind of like has like that type of experience and also a bit more of support of working with women's organization and particularly with the NAP, basically the office that was in charge of like dealing with all these debates and like discussions about the formulation of the NAP was the vice president and the Ministry of Equality. So I think that was probably more like towards the trust. I would say it was gaining mainly through the figure of this vice president woman that actually with the president, with the current president. But yeah, definitely like I think still kind of like having a dialogue between the government and like women's organization was essential to eventually at least being able to have like these outcomes or like these few outcomes. And you can see also the difference with the previous government that was the one of Ivan Duque between 2018 and 2022, that he basically never meet up with women's organization or like with human rights defenders and everything. And during that 4-year period, the implementation of the peace process actually went into a hold or was not as good or not as effective as it was expected. So yeah, like it's a bit of your question.
Thank you so much, Avila.
Yeah, could I just come in on that? I think it's an important question. And I think one of the problems is, well, a couple of problems. First of all, I think, in a situation where you're coming out of conflict, certainly I noticed it in Northern Ireland, there was almost a point when people were almost afraid to actually be overly critical of the situation of the governance because, our government, our governance was so fragile anyway. So there was almost like sort of a step back. And I think, one of the things that we really need is both a short-term strategy and a long-term strategy, because governments, are in and out. And as Daniela said, I mean, heavens knows what the next government, the next president in Colombia will be like. And we're the same, So women's groups work, and remember them on the call here, women's group work, for strategies. And then a new minister comes in and tears it up. And you're back to square one again. And it's very hard to maintain confidence and enthusiasm when that's happening over a 20 and 25-year period. So in some ways, if we can actually try and raise, as Detmar said in terms of Iraq, if we can actually try and raise the national action plans to say, look, this is the backbone of a longer term strategy. And we need to use that, if you like, as a scorecard about how these short-term governments are doing. Then I think that's important. But it is this, backwards and forwards. And again, in our situation, as I mentioned, with post-conflict, there's so many issues we haven't been able to deal with. We haven't been able to agree a troop commission. We haven't been able to agree a Bill of Rights, which actually was the responsibility of the British government to do, but they landed it back here, knowing it wouldn't go anywhere. So those sort of issues then tend to push down women's issues, in inverted commas, down the agenda again.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. And I think that's one of the reasons why, when I think about trust, exactly why we have continued focusing on women, peace, and security, because we kind of stand on the shoulders of, or at least I stand on the shoulders of feminist movements that have secured that architecture. And so there is something very tangible there, that either, you like the United Kingdom, you have a history of 5 national action plans, or like Colombia, you're a country that did not have a national action plan, but there's an international system you can use to create that and create something really tangible and concrete. And the reason why I say this when it comes to trust is exactly what Avila is saying. Like, all these cycles, promises get broken so easily. Even when a party running on a platform of international law and solidarity then wins, you don't necessarily see that translate in certain actions, as we see in the UK with the slashing of the aid budget, for example. But also we see that when there's agendas that come up that seem really progressive from certain governments, but are not backed up by this kind of international architecture, that again kind of has a really high chance of breaking this trust. And here specifically, I'm thinking about the feminist foreign policy agenda, particularly in Germany, where a one-term government with a more progressive slant came in and adopted that, and really made this as kind of international showpiece. And it was all very exciting. We were all very excited about it. But during feminist foreign policy, Germany more than tripled its weapon exports to Israel and silenced particularly women's rights organizations in Palestine and across the Middle East that expressed solidarity. And so as a feminist movement, now we have a global North colonial state who has determined, oh, this is what feminist is, and we're going to do these actions and still call them feminist. And I think that has really ruptured a lot of trust, I think, within the sector, because again, we're seeing these kind of flashy, exciting commitments made. And so I think that's where a lot of trust is lost, and where I think a government has a responsibility to figure out how to, in the global North, how to rebuild that with its own civil society. I'm happy to kind of have more questions come in, but I'm also happy to answer Nayla's question in the chat. Jonna, I'm in your hands.
Yeah, I think go ahead and follow up on Nayla's question. Absolutely.
Great. I'll just make it super quick. The question is about the new Syrian government and the impact on the WPS agenda in Syria. This is a really, really important question. I think Syria for a long time has been a country where there's been a lot of engagement, particularly on women's participation and the women's, I always get the exact name wrong, but there's the commission of women that was very involved in kind of figuring out what does this mean for Syria. And that commission has kind of been a very interesting learning for a lot of countries, and how to kind of bring in women in this, sometimes with success, sometimes with less. It's really hard right now, of course, to kind of speak on Syria, because it's changing and developing so fast. And I'm not an expert in Syria, so I do want to, make that very clear. For us at GAPS, what we are really focusing on is, first of all, what is the accountability now that the Assad regime has fallen? What is the accountability processes to address some of the root causes and root grievances and inequalities that have happened since and during Assad that must be confronted and resolved in order to kind of build forward. We also have been pushing for this kind of scenario planning. Like, while we don't know what's going to happen in Syria, we know it's a deeply unstable. So what are the kind of lessons learned by governments like the UK from what we've seen in Ukraine, Palestine, Sudan, Myanmar, you name it, and how to not be caught off guard? So again, a lot of scenario planning and figuring out what that looks like. And besides that, the main thing we are pushing for everywhere we go is whatever happens in Syria, whatever happens with Syria, must be led by Syrians themselves. And so what we push for is let it be led by Syrians themselves, and support what that looks like in an inclusive way. So, for example, when I think about Colombia, the UK has supported also some of that civil society participation. We have been fortunate enough to be involved in supporting some of those women's rights organizations in Colombia. Resource that, right? Like resource Syrian women's rights organizations so they can participate. They know what's best for Syria. We don't. So I think that's kind of the key part there. But yeah, as I said, everything is moving fast and it's very scary for many Syrians right now. But yeah, thank you for that question.
Thank you so much. Detmar, any other comments, thoughts, questions?
Jana, maybe just it's probably going over some stuff that's already been covered, but just because it's kind of topical at the minute, before I make my comment, just want to say thanks to everybody for all your presentations. Really, really, really interesting presentations. And it's just to pick up maybe on Detmar's bit about the funding of women's organisations and how, you know, is there any way of trying to encourage governments to recognise the value of the work that's being done, particularly that kind of grassroots work that you've all kind of talked about. And I think that in some cases it's only really valued when it's gone, and then it's harder to get it back. And so a lot of governments, and particularly our own, take a very short-term approach to things. So the cuts come off the back of making short-term savings, but doesn't look at the long-term implications which go across the full range of things, like poverty and addressing health issues and all of that sort of stuff. So I suppose it's really to talk about that government's value of the work that goes on in this sector. And we've already touched on the fact that I think you've all mentioned that change in politicians can make such a difference. And we're seeing that here at the minute with our gender equality strategy, which, as Jana said, is very much taken a back step, and it feels here like it's harder to protect what we have, never mind push for progress. So I suppose it's the question in amongst all of that is about, is there any way of getting governments to value the work that's done? I'm just thinking about the women's centres I work with a lot, that the governments and politicians just don't see the volume of work that goes on there. So it's way beyond even what they're contracted to do in terms of, whether that be childcare or courses, but they do so much to help address poverty and to, facilitate communities and cross-community work and all of that. So sorry, that's very long-winded. Thank you.
Who wants to have a go at some of that?
Well, I suppose, to be honest, it gets back to telling the story of that work, because otherwise it again just goes below the radar, and that is constant because the politicians keep changing, and to what extent can actually then sort of link that with perhaps trying to influence, if you like, from the bottom up, from the municipal and the local authorities up to national government. I think there's always a danger, even those politicians that come from grassroots backgrounds, that almost once they get into a position of electoral power, there's a sense of, well, we're here, so what are you on about? Because we're back. So in fact, I remember after the Good Friday Agreement elections, one politician who should be nameless actually saying that to me. Thanks very much for all you've done. Back in your box, we're back. And there is that attitude to an extent still, I think. And it just really needs, a constant sort of messaging. These are the issues. This is what people are saying. This is how the current situation is impacting on them. And this is what they're doing about it. And this is why it needs resourced. But then also trying to get that message out to a broader audience, to the people in the middle ground who then actually might reflect it back to decision makers. Because the trouble is, if it comes from identifiable feminist groups, the reaction is, well, they would say that anyway, wouldn't they? So it's to try and actually get perhaps the unsuspecting messengers actually talking about it. But it's just a non-stop effort, to be honest.
Absolutely. Danielle or Detmer?
I'm happy to come in briefly as well. Of course, working in advocacy, on your question is one I ask myself every day, and one that is very hard. I think a big part of it is really demonstrating the importance and the kind of examples of where we know things are going right. So I think part of that is really amplifying women's rights organizations, women-led organizations, on their accomplishments, what has actually happened. And then often we also see, right, that comparatively, the relatively modest resourcing compared to buying tanks and bombs and all that, right? Like that's something we do try to really amplify and push. Again, I think as the UK has recently demonstrated that has maybe not been as successful as we would have hoped. I think the other part is that we as a sector kind of are responsible for is also holding the line on how we talk about this. Right now, there's a really big shift to securitization, and everything that has to be done must be about security, must be about national security. And while that is a really tempting narrative, I think that we as a sector kind of have that responsibility to interrogate that and to also show that, okay, this is your conception of security. There's other conceptions as well. I think we kind of have, we need to be that kind of outside actor, I think, to kind of keep the pressure, provide alternatives. And yeah, don't let, I think one of the things that we've seen right now is like gender equality for the sake of gender equality is important, not just because it has another kind of ulterior motive attached to it that you might get to. While that path might also be relevant, gender equality for the sake of gender equality is also worth pursuit. So I think that's what we kind of try to convince but yeah, your question is a good one. And if anyone has a very clear answer, please let me know because it'll be very helpful.
Daniela, do you have any?
Yeah, nothing much really. I do think it's a very difficult answer to, or difficult question to answer. What I also comes into my head probably is which type of support recognition are you considering, or probably because in my head comes to I think that I have seen some academics also discussing not specifically with the case of women, but more with victims organization and probably recognizing their job kind of in seeking justice as a job, because you put some effort in seeking some resources, time resources. If you're a mother or if you're a woman also seeking for justice, you usually have to deal with childcare, but who is going to give you childcare if actually your effort of seeking justice is not a job or what we consider properly as an employment or anything. So they were discussing about possibilities of recognizing that type of activities as a job or not. But I think one of the kind of problems or challenges that will be in recognizing that type of efforts or these type of activities of activism as an employment is basically if it becomes kind of a monetary aspect to them, and how if maybe these movements may lose also some independency or in relation to activism, because at the moment that you start getting paid, particularly, probably you will start seen as you owe something to the person who is paying you, right? So some of level of independency will be lost in that type of situation. And I think also kind of thinking about the Colombian context. For example, one of the big problems that has now been happening with the current government, although the president has a very progressive type of agenda, what has been looking like is that he's kind of using all these social movements as tokens, or as a legitimation tokens, just for his own benefit in some way, or kind of gaining approval. But at the moment of the implementation of the policies, it's a bit different. So basically, for example, I think it was 2 months ago, he had a public kind of statement on television, the president, and he said that from his 190 commitments or proposals that he did at the moment of running as president, 140 have been unfulfilled. So, and he's already 2.5 years in his term, and it's a 4-year term. So basically, it's a bit further than a half on that. So also, like, although we have some trust, although we have some progressive kind of like discourses, although we try to rely on like these social movements as a way to change things in Colombia, like how actually has been done, when again, kind of like the leader politician Sabla said, like one thing is like trying to get their trust to get the votes, but then when you're in the post, you basically do little change or just use your image as to just gaining more kind of like votes probably after that, or like a legitimization, but actually no implementation is actually done. And for example, also in the NAP, I remember, so this has been discussed since 2022. The idea was to have an NAP by, I think it was like by the start of at the end of 2023, potentially the start of 2024. But in the end, the NAP was only done by the end of 2024. And it was basically the president had like a change of agenda or a change of priorities. So basically the women peace building became kind of like his last priorities, because he was more focused on getting like the approval of like labor reforms, pensions reforms, health reforms, that for him, that was kind of like bigger issues than actually dealing with women and peace building. But also, again, it's kind of like this idea of like how like local politics also affect all the efforts that women's organization might have. And but I do think it's essential for these type of organizations to remain as independent as they can, and also not being labeled just to be kind of like supporters of a specific presidential leader or presidential party, because later on that also will affect kind of like political persecution in relation to these type of organizations if the one who's in power is someone that doesn't agree with that point of view. So it's very important to remain as independent. I wouldn't say necessarily as neutral, but as independent as possible, to continue to doing these type of activities, and probably like gaining a space in institutional spaces too.
Thank you so much for that. And I think, that is easy to say, but it's extremely challenging to remain independent. And I think for me, that there's a cross-cutting thread in everything you're saying. It is that constant struggle to be in the discussion at all. Avila, you talked about, you expressly told, go back in your box. I think to come back to the gender equality strategy in Northern Ireland, the letter we got pretty much said the same thing. Go back to your box. You told us, never mind. But I suppose my question around that, or if you have any thoughts, and I'm conscious of time as well, is with the increase in focus on securitization, and do you think that might have a even further squeeze on funding streams and on the operating space? Because there seems to be certainly a tendency in European funding streams to follow the major political narrative. And I suppose the real question is, how do we resist that?
I mean, that is a difficult one. It's a $150 question at the moment, to be honest, with the way that the international narrative is going. And I'm acutely aware of it because Monica McWilliams and myself, about 2 weeks ago, spent a week in Warsaw with 20 elected Ukrainian women politicians and 20 NGO women leaders. And when they're talking about security, they were talking, to be quite honest, about the continued existence of Ukraine. And that was, now they were also incidentally talking about security in terms of saying, yes, but we can't forget that in terms of actually maintaining a resilient Ukraine in conflict, that we actually have to look at women's issues and community issues, because if the communities don't stay solid, and there is a danger that they will fragment, because you already have some of your poorer communities saying, well, what's the proportion of people on the front line? There actually are children. The better educators are the ones that are on doing the Channel 4 news bulletins, or on, delegations. So security is also, hearing and responding to those very local community issues, and building the confidence of people. Because actually, one of the women that was there headed up a sort of a social enterprise, which was training locally based rural women to establish and maintain generators, because the energy systems were being bombed to smithereens. So these were smaller generators that kept the lights on in the school, or in the local hospital. So but that sort of initiative is never talked about nor valued. And yet that builds a resilience and an agency in terms of those women who are, kilometers away from Kiev and that, but are in the community. So it is a matter of yes, rethinking security in terms of the broader macro issue, but also re-narrative, changing the narrative around security. And I don't necessarily think we'll win by sort of saying, oh, just ignore the sort of the macro threats. But I think we need to build out and sort of say, yes, there are certain investments you need to perhaps deal with the macro threats, but even more, there's investment in other levels. And one of those levels, incidentally, I think that we haven't mentioned is in countering the disinformation, the misinformation through social media. Because actually what those Ukrainian women were saying is, well, one of the reasons that there's all this demand to have elections is so that they can actually muck them up by sort of disinformation, and that's another form of warfare. So I think security has to be, conceptualized as more than the territoriality of bombs or guns or whatever, and looking at how the manipulation of social media and so far, makes people insecure as well.
Danielle or Detmer, any final comments, thoughts?
Well, not really. Like, I really like your point, Abla, about like the security and the issue of social media. For example, in Colombia was a big issue, like the campaign of disinformation at the moment of like the referendum for the peace agreement. So basically, the gender aspect was supposed to be even more broad. In the initial peace agreement, but because of like this campaign of like particularly more conservative political parties and Christian and Catholic groups, it eventually led to kind of like an anti-gender agenda that eventually also was one of the factors that led to for people in Colombia for voting no to the peace agreement. And in the renegotiation of the peace agreement, have like restricted a bit the initial concepts of gender. Although I think like in the implementation, there has been some improvements that have broadened again, kind of like these framings. But I think security is also kind of like a relevant aspect. I don't know, probably because Colombia is not kind of like a relevant actor in this international type of conflicts, like the one of Ukraine or like the one in Palestine. So not like our incidence is probably not as big, or we don't have like any control over these aspects, and it's actually not within our priorities in the local context to talk about what happens in Ukraine or what happens sometimes in Palestine. But at least security in the local situation of Colombia still is a big issue, because basically now, like what is putting under a threat the whole peace process in Colombia is the lack of security, especially in rural areas. So all these efforts in the end has been done for nothing in some way, because you can see that there is an increase of killings against human rights defenders, female women leaders, women environmentalist leaders, and also former fighters. Both female and male former fighters have been constantly being killed. And it's because of the resurgence, well, not even resurgence, they have always been there, but it's kind of like it's like restructuring of like the armed groups, and how the armed groups are not, at least in these civil conflicts or like internal conflicts, they're not focused anymore in these kind of like very traditional guerrilla war fighting or political type of conflicts, but it's conflicts related to the control of drug trafficking routes, the control of smuggling also routes, or like human trafficking routes, illegal mining. So kind of like the dynamics have changed a bit in like internal armed conflicts. And the problem is that this is because Colombia has been framed as an armed conflict process or a post-conflict process. Now, like the issue of like these organizations or like these new guerrilla groups, paramilitary groups that have changed completely to become drug traffickers, illegal mining, or criminal organizations in general, they are not being relevant, and that eventually has also contributed for the increasing of this insecurity like situation or state in Colombia, particularly in rural areas. So I don't know if you saw, but for example, in January, it happened like it was like really like crisis in one of the areas bordering Venezuela, because one of these guerrilla groups are like again massacring and like forcibly displacing people. So I think within the period of like 3 days, they displaced more than 80,000 people. But that's kind of like an issue of security. So I do agree, like security, as Avila said, probably we have to reframe it, but still is an important issue. And I still think like women's organization have also something to say in relation to security, because one of the main victims of like the insecurity situations will be like, it's very likely to be women, either by being killed or by being forcibly displaced, and also by having like additional burdens as, for example, childcare or protecting also their children in the case of their mothers, or also sometimes like having other care responsibilities if it's not children, probably like elderly parents and everything. So yeah, it's like the burden for them, it's even bigger. So yeah, I still think security must be an issue for discussion in women's organization, and also be included within the agenda, but probably reframing it from the traditional way that we see security or security policies in general.
That's a very important point. Detmer, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, to make it super short, as I agree with what Phil and Daniela are saying. Yeah, exactly. I think it's as more funding goes towards that hard security approach, I think it's a responsibility to consider, right? Like, well, what does a security when peace and security stand for? What does human security stand for? What are the ways we can hold the line in those spaces? What does that look like? In the United Kingdom, for example, the Ministry of Defense does have women, peace and security, and human security commitments. How do we use that? And I think in that we need to be especially mindful and learn the lessons from mistakes we have made before when it comes to securitization. I'm thinking particularly around the counter-violent extremism and the counterterrorism agendas, where securitization has often led to increased insecurity, often for racialized communities and other communities. So I think one is a very, very clear reckoning we have to do with that, and a learning from that, that if we engage in this security space, or we're kind of being forced into it, that we don't make the same mistakes, that we don't become kind of victim of that civil society washing that Daniela really outlined really well, that it's not unique to the Colombian government at all. And yeah, that we also take, I think, last thing, this kind of transnational approach. I think that social media component is really important, and coming from like living in a country where so many social media companies are headquartered, right? What are the kind of security responsibilities there? When I talk to our Sudanese partners, a lot of the Sudanese misinformation that is being spread doesn't originate in Sudan. It originates outside of Sudan, but it's causing offline consequences in Sudan. So what does it mean for, right? Like where X and Instagram and Telegram and you name it, where they are headquartered. So I think that might also be a pivot for North-based organizations to hold those kind of companies to account.
Thank you so much, everybody. And I think this conversation could go for a long time, but we've come to the end of our session. So it just remains for me to say thank you so much to all our panelists, to Avila, Daniela, and Detmer. And I think it's been a really enlightening hour and a half looking at what we can learn from each other, and very interesting practice, and how much wider we need to have this discussion in the current context. But thank you so much, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.